Welcome to the Lindsay Year Symposium. This is a symposium in which we're exploring the innovations and changes that were made during the years that John Lindsay was mayor of the city of New York, from 1966 to 1973, and the challenges and efforts that he undertook in order to make New York a livable city in a time that was quite tumultuous in the New York and the national history. I want to welcome you to this program and to join the program that's in progress. I'm happy to introduce the moderator of our second panel, who will in fact introduce the other two members of the panel, Mark Holzer, who is the Dean of the School of Public Affairs and Administration out at Rutgers in Newark. At the time of the Lindsay administration was a member of the John Jay faculty. And in fact, as the city began to convert some of the project management ideas that were being born during the first administration and began to look at accountability and ways to kind of improve the productivity of city agencies, Mark was doing work from the academic side, kind of looking at how all these pieces fit together. And so I'm delighted that Mark has agreed to come and kind of moderate the second panel, which is basically begins to cover the second term of the Lindsay years. Mark?
I'll be sort of interviewing Ed Hamilton, and then Barbara Cohn will be will be commenting. And Ed Hamilton, as many of you know, was the deputy mayor and is chairman of Hamilton, Rabinowitz, and Associates in Los Angeles. Barbara Cohn is vice president of the Fund for the City of New York and has been a participant, observer, and catalyst in New York City government for a long time. My own involvement has been at a little bit of a distance, as Stan indicated. But I want to begin by just thanking Ed and the other people in the room who were instrumental in this, because I built my career in large part on this, studying productivity and what we now call performance, and following that with a National Center for Public Performance, formerly for Public Productivity. But it was really what caught my imagination in the early 70s, with this whole productivity emphasis and how it applied to the agencies, and particularly the police department at that time. And I know there was a conference which I think was held at the Statler Hilton opposite Penn Station in '72 probably, where.
That's right.
Right? We're
73, actually.
73, okay, close. Which really, was the beginning of my study, all of this. And Fred Lane, who was in the back, was also there. I just to acknowledge Fred's involvement. Fred's emeritus at Baruch. So that the New York City Productivity Program, I think, was responsible for launching what has now become a much more widespread effort, not only in the United States but worldwide. And I really say that from a very factual basis. So, I just wanted to begin by just quoting Fred Hayes, who was quoting Ed Hamilton, probably from that conference, or Ed, where you said that the program was a 225-page statement of work objectives and units of measures keyed to a specific timetable with quarterly sub-targets. The first comprehensive set of objective measures of administrative accomplishment in all large-scale program areas, which any major government has made available for public scrutiny and comment. So my first question is, what led you to the program? What was the impetus for the program? Did it, as Fred suggests in this book I'm quoting from, come out of the Bureau of the Budget, from Kerr and Thomas and himself, I guess, or did it come from the need for improving services in a very tangible way?
Well, first, let me be clear that anything I was able to do, or those of us working with me were able to do, reflected the fact that we were standing on the shoulders of some great folks. You've heard a lot about Fred Hayes. Fred Hayes was, in fact, exactly as described, both an architect of change and someone who managed the extremely delicate cultural problem of dealing with two very different cultures of the kind that Peter Goldmark described. He also assembled most of the infrastructure that was necessary to talk about a comprehensive productivity program. A lot of it was human. There's a lot of people who would never have come to the city except for the recruiting efforts that Fred and the mayor and Peter and various other people, Jay Kriegel, were able to exert. So that I was the beneficiary coming in at the beginning of the second term of a whole infrastructure creation process, both institutional and human, as well as a substantial body of data and a whole series of project by project, program by program analytic infrastructure that made it possible even to talk about a comprehensive productivity program. I didn't invent any of that. That actually was Fred, David Grossman, and a variety of other people, including, incidentally, some very heavy lifting career people. The biggest jungle cat at that time was Harry Bronstein, who was the chief examiner of the Budget Bureau and then took a great demotion and became head of the personnel office, but maintained pretty good control of the career staff in the Budget Bureau even so. And getting Harry to get something to happen was about 80% of the task in any particular situation. Getting Harry to keep from stopping something was 80% of the task in terms of getting obstacles out of the way. Partly out of institutional, Harry is deceased, as most of you know, part of institutional loyalty to the budget director, which for Harry was a great force, but also personal loyalty and just pride of professional performance. He was an enormous asset, and therefore when we talk about the admixture of analytic talent, Fortune magazine did a piece in the early 70s saying that there had never been as spectacular an assembly of analytic talent as this administration had. We were building on not only the strengths of those analysts, but the very powerful strengths of the leaders of the career force who could be persuaded that it made sense to move in this direction. Now, the productivity program itself, therefore, was in some sense a comprehensive congealing, as it were, of a whole series of things and capabilities that had occurred before. It couldn't have been done before 1971. On the other hand, once we were in a position to talk in comprehensive terms, we were in fact equipped to deliver on that in the sense of producing a system that could increase, as someone was asking in the questions, increase the value to the daily lives of individuals living in a very turmoil-ridden city in an even more turmoil-ridden general atmosphere. Now, productivity in the public sector is a major intellectual problem, quite apart from operational. And therefore, this particular area was pretty much unexplored. Those of you who know the history of municipal management know that in the early years of the 20th century, there was something called the Municipal Bureau movement, in which one of the early leaders, for example, was Robert Moses, which developed the notion that it's possible to think in objective terms about the delivery of public services, that is, municipal services in particular. But that got a civil service classification system. It got a movement towards city managers in cities of less size and complexity than this one. But it pretty well stopped there. The major intellectual problem is measuring the value of the service and marrying it to its price. If you are a student of the national income accounts, if you're economists, you know that one of the difficulties always in valuing public sector is that you don't know how to price it. And so you price it essentially by what it costs. That is to say, you add up the appropriations, and that must be what it's worth. But getting those price levels down to unit costs so that you know what it's costing you to produce a given level of output in a particular operational setting in the public sector is a brutally subtle kind of intellectual exercise. Beyond that, it fights a whole series of cultural forces which really don't like it. For example, this is a heavily unionized city. It's an even more heavily unionized public workforce. Unions draw their strength in large part from uniformity among their members. What they really don't need is a lot of special treatment, a lot of, for example, you see the argument going on about merit pay for teachers. That is, when you start paying some people more for performance, or you start exerting one form or another of differentiated policy or differentiated program expectation, you're really messing with the fundamental dynamic that keeps union leaders sane, something that doesn't always work to that extent. The union has huge strengths and great advantages, and if you can get them, the sanitation union, for example, in our day, was a spectacularly good partner in virtually everything we were doing. But the whole business of trying to put into the mix a sense of cost benefit, that is, say, what are you getting for what you pay, and how do you know it? And more important in many ways, how do the people know it? Now, you asked the question then, how did the program start? Like all things of this kind, necessity is a very important factor. We were shrinking the labor force fairly substantially because of major budget problems. We lost about 2,000 policemen, for example, in this a couple of years we're talking about, all through attrition. They weren't layoffs. We lost about 400 firemen. Our workforce was declining because we couldn't afford, even with very substantial efforts to increase state aid, we couldn't afford to keep up with the inflating costs of the existing workforce. We needed everything we could get to get the biggest bang for the buck we could, simply to stand still in many areas because of the shrinkage of our resources. So even if we had not been such good-spirited, altruistic, progressive, generally public-minded folk, we would have had to do something about managing this process better. Now, there were a whole variety of different aspects of it. If any of you who are true insomniacs, I did a piece in the Public Administration Review in December 1972 called Productivity, the New York City Approach, which, if you really want it laid out, I'm an absolute traitor to the consultants union in that I haven't put together a slideshow of the kind that Carter so usefully did. But if you want to see it all with case studies and all the usual stuff, it's there.
Well, I can quote from that if you'd like. But it's
no, I seem to remember it, actually. No, but
I commend that article, but Fred Hayes has it summarized here.
Well, what I can do is to give you the themes and then one or two examples, and we'll go on in whatever direction you want to go. It turns out in our administration, everything had to be fourfold. That is to say, there were always four objectives. I think that was an improvement over Wagner, who was always three. But as Carter was saying, there were four in his system. Incidentally, Carter, his role, I think, was not exactly portrayed. Carter was always with McKinsey, but McKinsey established a unit which worked at the behest of Fred Hayes and David Grossman, established a unit which really worked almost entirely on city problems. This is one of Hayes' institutional innovations. Fred Hayes' object in life was to get the best people he could find in whatever way he had to get them, either as city employees or a New York City Rand Institute or McKinsey. Whatever device had to be put together in order to get very good people next to hard problems, that's what Fred wanted to do. And Carter, we had a small political problem once when the city printed the Green Book showing Carter as an assistant director of the budget. Now, there was a controller at the time, a fellow named Abraham Beam, who noticed that and immediately started an investigation as to how a private sector profiteer like Bales could possibly be a city employee while he was drawing money from this nefarious private sector place. Fortunately, that sort of, as it deserved to do, it sort of whittled away. But we did have, now and then, one of these symbolic bumps in the road. My point, though, is if you look at the productivity program and the four sort of fundamental ideas, or more accurately, the four areas in which it tries to move. First are so-called investment return functions. There are functions of a city government which have a lot of very great similarities to private sector. That is to say, there's a cost, there's a benefit, the whole thing is measurable. There are things that are turnstiles that are turning, or products that are being delivered. You can actually do typical private sector type investment return analysis. And those areas street paving, for example, sanitation, refuse delivery, all kinds of unit cost measurements in those areas. That's in some way, or if you think of it as the low-hanging fruit, those are the things that it's easiest to apply, what everybody would understand to be standard productivity analysis. However, most of the service provision elements, particularly human services, that are presented are anything but two-dimensional in the sense of the way that you can measure output and match it up against cost. What a cop does, for example, is just as important. What he doesn't do is what he does. So if you hitch an incentive to some particular act, i.e., for example, or e.g., arresting, the number of arrests, you will get a whole lot of arrests. It's not clear, however, that you have increased police productivity. You may, in fact, have caused yourself major problems because if every cop on the street decides that somebody's spitting on the sidewalk when it's 97 degrees and the racial turmoil is there, and the cop happens to be Caucasian and the spitter happens to be African American, and the cop decides this is a great time for an arrest because of the violation of the public health law, which it is, to spit on a public sidewalk, that's a major non-productive event. That is not what you want police incentivized to do. So in the areas of the subtler services, getting your incentives right means understanding that you don't have a simple-minded, clear-cut, straightforward, everybody understands it, measure of productivity. What you've got are three things. One, you know something about the cost, and if you work at it hard, you can figure the unit cost for particular kinds of activities. Second, you know that there are some services or some elements of the service which you can't quantify and therefore always are going to be subjective. And third, you know that if you work at it, you can develop ways to maximize the probability that your people will be and the equipment and the various resources that go into the service will be where they're most needed when they are most needed. If you don't know, for example, that the pattern of refuse pickup in the city, in the residential areas, is very uneven, and therefore you don't collect it all on Sundays, so you have a huge load on Monday and a pretty big load on Tuesday, and the whole thing then tapers down until you don't have nearly as much on Saturday, and then the process starts again on Monday. But meanwhile, you've got your people, the crews, absolutely even through the course of the week. That produces lots of non-picked up refuse. It produces all kinds of things which any human being walking down the street will tell you is not productive. That is, you need more productive use. If you do know that, however, and if you're able to work through the various barriers, the uniformity barriers I was talking about, in order to manage in a differentiated fashion the particular workload and response pattern that you can put together for that week, and if you can get it negotiated through productivity bargaining, which we tried to introduce, I think with good success, then you can actually make a given number of dollars and a given number of trucks, about 1,600 sand trucks, for example, to produce a very much higher rate of return in terms of how much productivity occurs. The third area is organizational and systemic. I think it was David who was talking earlier about the classic issue. There's something we call with the jaw-breaking title systemic incompatibility. When I console around the country, I use that phrase and then watch people's eyes glaze over and then try to make it live in some form or another. This particular case is an interesting one. The way the sanitation process was working, we discovered, or more accurately, my predecessors discovered, 38% of the trucks were out all the time. They were down at any given time. 38%, 1,600 trucks, 38% down at any given time. Nonsense if you look at any private operation that is trying to do even vaguely similar things involving truck fleets. What's the matter? Well, one very important part of the matter were the two systems which made perfect sense individually, when put together, produce disaster. In this case, one system said, if you're a mechanic and you rise in the sanitation mechanics pyramid, as you rise, you have more seniority to bid on your location. That is to say, which of the sanitation facilities you work at. Now, being a normal human being, you decide that where you want to work is close to where you live. That made sense. So it made sense in terms of the internal construct of the union and the tradition, et cetera. Now, cheek by jowl with that is a system that says we're going to put a major repair shop in the middle of roughly the middle of this whole jurisdiction. That's where we're going to do the heavy lifting. We're going to do the block replacements. We're going to do all the big stuff which requires specialized equipment. And then we're going to have satellite repair shops around various other places in the city, and by definition, there are a whole lot more satellites than there were the central area. Now, when you put the first system next to the second, what you get is a lot of people in the senior reaches of the mechanics hierarchy who are working in the minor repair shops. A, that's lousy policy because they're the best people at handling the big stuff. But B, culturally, they don't want to handle the little stuff. They want to handle the big stuff. And so they work hard at persuading various district sanitation officers to move to put their trucks into these satellite repair shops in order to get major repairs. Now, there isn't equipment in those satellite shops to be able to handle major repairs, and the whole parts inventory and parts distribution system depends on the notion that the major parts will be in the central area. The result is that you have very slow lead times, roughly 3 days. It took 1 day to requisition the order, the second for the order to get filled, the third for the order to come back to the shop where it was started. The result of that, if you add that all up together, is a whole lot of mechanics who are not working 8-hour days, who are more like 4.5-hour days, and you have 40% of the trucks down, 38% of the trucks down at any given time. Just managing a process, as David was suggesting, of decentralizing that repair function and making it possible for the satellite shops to do bigger stuff and to be designed and parts inventory to do that made a huge difference. The final, and I'll stop this endless monologue, the final of the four is true technological innovation. David was talking about slippery water. Slippery water is a polymer additive which makes water flow more easily through a given size hose. That was a city invention, or City and Rand Institute invention. Methadone, the only substitute for heroin that has ever been shown to actually produce the kind of phenomenon which has, I think, helped a lot in the drug treatment area. That was a city invention. Cities don't invent technologies. Cities are not in the business of doing research. That isn't what they're normally programmed to do. This one did, and it fought the fight. We were talking earlier about John Lindsay. John Lindsay was prepared to stand behind any request for an appropriation to get, for example, management tools, inventive capacity, first quality people. He was willing to go to bat for that, even if it cost him an arm and a leg, and politically it often did, either with the unions or with the press or whatever. Now, the final point I would make is that the device that the Comprehensive Productivity Program really most levered was, given all the resources I've talked about, was the body politic. If people don't care about productivity, if they can't see that something is happening in their neighborhoods, et cetera, if they can't expect to be reported to on this, the thing will die politically. It's got to have the engine of people who actually are paying attention. So our quarterly reports, which we put out each quarter until the end of the administration, which called them the way we saw them. That is to say, we set out the objectives in this 225-page tome we were talking about, and then we tracked them. And we reported every quarter. And we said, here is where we seem to have succeeded, and this is why we think we have. And here are the areas where we're not doing as well as we ought to, and where we're kicking various people's behinds in order to get better performance. That became a quarterly event, and it produced a kind of rhythm, a pulse to the process politically, which was worth its weight in diamonds in order to get something done. Because one of the things that is least understood, and it's still true actually for the most part in public service, is that public servants really care about how they look. If you can demonstrate that someone has in fact improved a process, saved money, made things cleaner, whatever the objective is, and you can demonstrate to the people who are reading this, that is the attentive public, that this sort of thing is going on. These people love that kind of recognition, and they hate the notion that they're going to be shown up as not being able to do this. And the result is you get a lot of self-discipline, which would never occur but for the publication of this. That's one of the elements, incidentally, of productivity programs, or as Mark was saying, performance measurement, performance reporting programs, which has really hung on. That is to say, there's a lot more visibility now to this than there was. End of long and answer.
Okay. So you answered many of my other questions, but let me pose one more for you for a short answer, which is how necessary was it to bring in outside talent to overcome the bureaucratic resistance, which I know was very frustrating to the mayor and to others? So was it the outsiders who made the difference? Was it the insiders who eventually adopted that type of ethic who continued to make the difference in subsequent administrations?
Well, I don't entirely agree with the use of the word resistance. It was more, not quite apathy, but certainly a general sense that change was not either possible or very useful. One of the problems with a workforce this large is that people tend to get the sense that the city is like the sea, that it rolls on, and that trying to change anything much in it is simply a feat beyond human persuasion, so that the city's workforce can easily become essentially an economic support mechanism in their views, as distinguished from something actually trying to do something, get something to happen. And this is not bad-spiritedness. It's just that it's very hard in a sea of people and programs and politics and unions and all the things that are happening in New York to believe that you can, in fact, get something changed. You can get something different to occur. You, not some nabob, but you. It wasn't so much resistance as much it was persuading people, A, that it was possible, B, that it made sense in terms of their own futures, and C, that having contributed to it, that in fact the place they lived in would be a better place. Now, keep in mind, a lot of city employees don't live in the city, so it's not by any means a zero-sum game from that point of view. On the other hand, it was, I think, a very important one. Having said that, the admixture of people was absolutely necessary, there's no doubt. The outsiders made huge difference. But the great mass of the actual activity that went on and the change in behavior and attitude, whatever, was always at in the career staff. If you could get that to happen, you had something going. If you couldn't, Harry Bronstein once, I remember some analyst who he was particularly unhappy with, which for a long time were a fair number of analysts, said, somebody called him up, some agency head called him up and said, I got this guy in my office, and he's telling me I have to do X, Y, and Z, and and he's 25 and I'm 58, and he's been here 2 weeks and I've been here 35 years, and what do I do with this guy? And Harry said, send him out for a bucket of steam. As long as that's the sort of general reaction among the career staff, you are going nowhere. On the other hand, Harry Bronstein cared desperately about the city of New York. He did believe he could make a difference. He'd been making a difference for a long time. The reason he had risen to where he was because he made differences. And if you could harness that, or more accurately, get him to harness himself, nobody was going to harness Harry. That turned out to be a huge achievement. And guys like David, for example, and Peter, and Fred Hayes, in some ways above all, were absolutely excellent at that. They could motivate somebody who had infinitely greater experience, infinitely greater, infinitesimally, minutiae level knowledge of the city. They could motivate that person to be the best person he could be and become a leader who in many ways could lead you places that you wouldn't have thought of yourself.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's move over to Barbara Cohen now. Barbara?
Well, let's see. I worked in government before the Lindsay administration, throughout it, and after it. And if there are some students in the room just interested in career planning, I certainly didn't plan mine. I never thought I would work in government. I got a first job at city planning, a 6-month, on someone's leave of absence to earn some money for books for my graduate study. But then one thing and another happened, and I'm only mentioning this for the students, but it is true how things evolve. There was an opportunity in the mayor's office to do some analysis of neighborhood issues. Then there was a new housing agency that was formed, and I went to work there in research. And then rent control was transferred back to the city of New York, and I ended up in that agency about which I knew nothing and didn't like the sound of at all, but ended up actually running that agency, a huge, complex agency, during the time when, as David mentioned, the Lindsay administration was overhauling it. So one never knows what opportunities come up, but each of those were difficult, very difficult jobs. I often didn't think I would last the next day, certainly in rent control, but they were most rewarding, and I really hope that students here will seriously consider working in government. My current work is heading the Center on Government Performance at the Fund for the City of New York and its national affiliate, the National Center for Civic Innovation, where we have been bringing the voices of the people to government performance measurement, reporting, and management. And we also run a government Trailblazer program. We've been doing focus groups since 1995 to hear what the voices of the people say about government performance. And we run a 70-city Trailblazer program, encouraging cities and counties all over the United States and in Canada to do similar things. Now, I'm here because I see a definite connection between the productivity programs started in the Lindsay administration that never happened before and what's happening now. It's been an up and down. It's been terminology that has changed to some extent, but the patterns are very clear. And I need to tell you why, and it's a little story, but I think a lot of this happened because it's helped Mark do his work and my work. And that is that in 1994, the then president of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which had funded the Top 40 program, if any of you remember that, which was also created by Lindsayites, and Stan Altman was very much involved in that, came and said that he was very concerned about the way people distrusted government. And he was also very concerned about the fact that people couldn't find out what government was doing and why they were doing it. And he funded a very small trial program with a think tank in Washington to see if he could get some better understanding of the federal government. For some reasons I don't understand, I was asked to come to see that presentation in Washington. It wasn't a really scintillating presentation. It was a very hot day. It lasted a very long time. Then we were all flying back to New York. It was a stormy day, and we got stuck in what was then National Airport. So the president, who I didn't know very well, didn't look very happy. I had a terrible headache, and anyway, he said to me, "So Barbara, what did you think of that presentation?" And normally I would have been very diplomatic and said, it was quite interesting, but I didn't feel that it was, and I was annoyed at why I was there, and I said, gee, I don't understand what you're trying to do. And so he explained to me his terrible frustration with government, and I said, you know, you shouldn't start with the federal government, you should start at the local level where you can see the direct results of what government does. There are measurable things, and let me explain to you and tell you what happened during the Lindsay administration, which I did. And I told him about what the productivity report, which then morphed into the mayor's management report, but it's essentially the same concept. And he was fascinated, and he said, well, I want to do more of that. How can I do that? What should we do? And he asked us to convene at the Fund for the City of New York, a small symposium of press, government people, academics, and so on. And from that spawned a multi-million-dollar program called, for lack of a better term, Citizen-Involved Performance Measurement and Reporting. So it's enabled Mark to create curricula to train graduate people in this field. It's enabled us to do our work. I just want to say that I want to mention 3 things that I see as direct links from the Lindsay years to what's going on now. One is data-driven management, which you've heard a lot about in the first panel. That didn't happen before the Lindsay administration. Decisions were made politically or haphazardly. Presently, it's now called performance measurement, but when done correctly, it's very similar. There are factual, objective measures relevant to government operations and to the public. They include reports, which include inputs and output data and costs, and now what we stress, outcomes. You were talking about effectiveness. It's the same thing. It's just outcomes happens to be the word of the day, although we know what we're talking about. And we learned from our focus groups that the people are interested in outcomes. They can't relate to costs. Is it enough money? Is it too much money? Are they laying down too much tar on the streets or not enough? Are they collecting enough garbage? They want to know, are the streets clean? Are the roads smooth? So the other thing is about these reports. Those reports were regularly issued. And now, as a result of these programs, well, we know of at least 100 places in the country who were not before this initiative producing regular reports that are available to the public. What they were doing before were producing the budget came out of the budget office, incomprehensible sheets of paper that I don't know who read. It was dropped on the desks of legislators or whatever, and then the decisions were made in the usual political way. Now they're producing reports that are accessible to the public. They're on every website. Some are finding all kinds of fanciful ways of involving young people in illustrating them and so on, and people are now able to drill down and understand government better. It's also certainly now not just reports, but it's performance management. And let me just say that 2 really remarkable things have happened in this last year as a result of this. One is the GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, has, after years and years of work and angst, come up with guidelines for reporting of performance information. So that affects anyone. It's not required, it's voluntary, but this is a major, major step in making what John Lindsay and his administration and the people here started a nationwide effort. Also, the Government Finance Officers Association, a huge organization, created a commission a couple of years ago called the National Performance Management Advisory Commission, and they too felt that it was really important for their members, many of them budget people and so on, to bring their expertise into the management, day-to-day management and improvement of government. So they just issued a report, again, took a long time, called A Performance Management Framework for Measurement and Reporting to Management and Improving. These are all ideas that were spawned and were actually executed in the Lindsay administration. So my sense is that that heritage and that legacy lives on, and it's a really significant one.
Before we open for questions, let me just add that the state of New Jersey is now trying to develop what amounts to a governor's management report, and that has roots in the Lindsay administration, because that report really is based on the initiative of the treasurer, Andrew Sindeman-Erostoff, whose father worked in the Lindsay administration. And he called me up and said, we talk about this, and really, so we went over and talked with him, formed a team to work with him, team of students, by the way, who are gaining a lot of experience this way, and the concepts that he really wants to implement in New Jersey, which is on a statewide basis, which could be very much a model for other states, I think are rooted in the concepts of what really began under the Lindsay administration. So that's just one little, one example to follow up on Barbara's, and certainly we're aware of many, many other examples at the municipal level, the state level, the federal level, and around the world. I mean, the Europeans are very interested in this. The Koreans are very interested in this, and a lot of work has been done in Australia, New Zealand, the British Commonwealth, and not to say that it all goes back to the Lindsay administration, but that was a very important, impetus. And as Ed was saying, it really, that had roots back in the Bureau of Municipal Research, 1906, in New York City, and all. So we've been building on all of this on a substantial, incremental basis. And actually making progress, and it's taking root there. So let's open it up for questions. Have any burning questions that if we overwhelmed you with details? Yes.
Right now, there's a real crisis in the people's confidence in government in terms of its effectiveness and the delivery of essential services. High taxes, but low expectations. What, in terms of what the Lindsay administration did in terms of the reports, not just reports, but productivity and effectiveness measurement, can we now translate and bring to the movement for teacher evaluation, for example, based on student achievement or lack of achievement? What can we do in terms of those kinds of performance levels in terms of MTA? WABC just had a report last night where there's apparently a breakdown in management. They have all these cleaners who don't clean the subways. They sit down and read the newspaper. Mm-hmm. And when the manager was asked, what are you going to do about it? He said, well, I don't know. I guess it's a management crisis. What can these, beyond giving reports, how do we measure, how do we put the system that Lindsay put in place into modern practice so that we can really demonstrate to the people that government is either working, or when it's not working, it will be improved and changed?
Let's start with the teachers, because I think that's one of the great challenges we have now. And what we see in that one is the usual Scylla and Charybdis problem we have in performance measurement, which is, on the one hand, people argue that nothing is measurable that is useful. Or important the other way, nothing useful is measurable. That is, if something is really worth doing or understanding with it, can't measure it. That's one pole. The other pole says everything can be reduced to some quantitative measure, hopefully as simple a quantitative measure as possible. And then one can maximize that variable, whatever it is, and thereby cure the problem. The argument, since it is a very complicated issue, and no one in the end really knows what is the ideal, the optimal teaching establishment, particularly where the students are from disadvantaged areas or have language problems or all the problems of the inner city. The argument tends to oscillate between those two rather than addressing something in between. Now, fortunately, because the arguments are going to be going on for a while, it has gotten to the point where people understand that what you really need in order to have some sense of teacher productivity is a whole portfolio of measures, not simply standardized tests, but a series of subjective analyses, a variety of things, which if you add them together, they're going to be directionally right. They may not be precise, but you'll know the really excellent teacher from the not good teacher, and you will know that in a way that you feel you can defend to yourself and to various constituencies. It's hard to do. It involves a lot of work. And it also doesn't make up for a series of other variables which are very hard to get into the equation, but are very important. One of the major ones is the simple time. If you look at all of the education improvement areas around the country, that is the sort of, we don't have any district-wide examples, but we have a lot of rifle shot examples, like Geoffrey Canada's operation in Harlem, for example. If you look at any one of those, you find one variable is always there. It's absolutely consistent in all of them. Longer school day, longer school year, more hours spent at the business of education, however you define it. If you don't have that, if the kids who don't start out with the advantages of a sort of an education-conscious middle class or upper class kind of history, you're not going to get there, regardless of how good the teacher is. The great teacher will make the student better, but the student will not, for example, manage to close the gap, the achievement gap, between disadvantaged kids. Incidentally, it's not so much a matter of race, it's a matter of disadvantaged lifestyle against others. That isn't going to happen, so you mix those things together. Now, longer school days and longer school years are expensive. They violate every known union rule. They represent, if for any other profession, asking people to work longer hours is very hard to imagine people sort of saying yes, unless you're in a profession where longer hours are accepted and you get very well paid for it. If every teacher were in fact reasonably certain that by doing very good work and meeting that portfolio of standards over a period of, say, 10 years, would be making $100,000 a year, the teacher force would be different. And if you add in the other things, that is to say the portfolio of measures and the longer school day and the other things that you need, you will get a sea change in American education. I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's mind. The problem is getting the configuration of political and economic and cultural forces into some sort of concerted situation where you can get that to happen. That would be my answer.
Barbara?
I agree with you. Reports on their own are not going to do it, although it is a major change to be able to access information about government that never was there before. Many things were tried in the Lindsay administration. One of them that was very powerful to me was the idea of little city halls. And what my point is that I think the idea of bringing government closer to the people and people closer to government is a very powerful and important thing. And what we've learned through our work, when the budget people or the people who are doing these performance measures actually sit down in focus groups or listen to focus groups and listen to people, or do one of our big programs is called computerized neighborhood environment tracking, where neighborhood people go out with government people often to identify on computers what it is that they think is wrong, whether it's garbage or graffiti or a number of other things, and then they sit down with them and say, why is that? The two groups see government in a very different way. It's no longer the angry public hearing where everybody's already set their opinions and they're very defensive, but they learn why government is doing it the way it is doing it. Government is learning, oh, well, I didn't know that this was important. And so we see changes on both sides. So people maybe soften their position because now they understand that there are other priorities. If the bridge is going to fall down, they'd rather have the bridge fixed than the graffiti removed, if that's the choice. But on the other hand, government saying, why are we measuring this anyway? Or why are we doing this if it's not doing any, let's rethink it. Mm-hmm. So I think that many ways, and through the websites and a number of, there's technology now to bring government and the public closer, that could very well help and is helping.
Let me just add in terms of the question, the two-part question that was asked. There's two different aspects of measurement here. One, in the MTA case, I think what the measures do is really embarrass poor performers. And that means the managers and the cleaners. And the Strap Hangers campaign, which was funded by the Sloan Foundation initiative that Barbara mentioned, is very instrumental in that. And the city should try to figure out how to keep things like the Strap Hangers campaign alive. And because they serve a very important function.
Their schmutz records are going to really soar this year.
That's right. And they get a lot of press. Okay, but that's the question where you want to embarrass poor performers. On the school side, it's a different question. It's a very complicated system in terms of how you educate kids. And I think there, frankly, are very few poor teachers out there. I think there are teachers who are frustrated by being caught in this system. What the measures do is they begin to help you diagnose what the problems are within the system, and that's the school system, and that's the other systems that interact with it, such as the criminal justice system, and that's the whole social network in a sense. So that's where you begin to pick it apart. And if you want a good discussion of that, look to the letters of the editor in the Times last week, where they really had a good dialogue on this, and whether you use standardized tests or portfolios or whatever. But we need to be able to address that. It's going to be expensive to fix it, but we can't afford not to. So let's go to the next.
The record will show a dissent on the notion that there aren't many poor teachers out there.
Good morning. Could you say a few words about the interplay between autonomy at the bottom and command and control at the top? I mean, that always seems to be the classic question. And what was the thinking, what was this philosophical thinking of that era? And because it seems that it was moving in two different directions depending on the agency. So, a lot of command and control at the police department after some of the scandals of the era, and then, of course, decontrol in the schools. And the other thing I haven't heard much about this morning is the war on poverty and all the flood of federal money that was coming in. And how did that affect managerial questions, both in terms of the quantity of money coming in and also, depending on the program, different strings attached that might have limited your ability to evaluate?
Mm-hmm. Well, on the first question, there are some agencies that are built as hierarchies. That is, a police department is a hierarchy, a military-style, core, CORPS type personnel system. It is designed to be run from the top down. All of its internal culture assumes that orders will come down, not that people will be sort of entrepreneurs out there doing their own thing. On the other hand, the other problem in that is that the people who are on the street are doing their own thing. That is, a policeman is a walking magistrate. As I was saying earlier, he makes decisions as what to do and what not to do, which are situationally aware, one hopes. And one actually holds him to that, him or her, and increasingly now her. That whole conflict is always there in a hierarchical organization, just as it is in the military, for example. We were talking earlier, the last panel was talking about PPBS, this program budgeting system. That was born in the Defense Department, the invention of Charlie Hitch, Assistant Secretary, and his deputy, then successor, Alan Enthoven. And it was grafted onto the rest of the federal government with indifferent success in some areas. And that was what was being adapted, though, as you saw, Fred was very careful to adapt it in opportunistic bursts rather than comprehensive. So that whole that thing started with a hierarchical system, i.e. the Department of Defense, and had to be adapted to civilian agencies or municipal agencies who are very different. So you start with the proposition you have some hierarchical agencies. On the other hand, you have other agencies which are distinctly not hierarchical, which really do have most of the energy and the innovation and whatever, and for that matter, the tradition, the enforcement of tradition, coming from the bottom. That means you have to, as the golfer would say, you have to play it as it lies. That is to say, there are those agencies where you can do things top down and have to, and there are those where you can't and you have to understand the difference. And if you can't do it top down, then you have to devise a tailored strategy keyed to that particular agency or that particular subset of that agency, which tries to get a dynamic going which doesn't depend on top-down direction, but depends on some other mechanism by which you persuade people at the bottom or the operating level to do things other than the way they've been doing. That's a neat trick. That's hard to do. And there's no question that I think that we did it unevenly. That is to say, we were not as successful in some areas as others. But if you take it on in that tailored way, I think you at least have a shot. Now, on the question of the war on poverty money, one of the things, it's like federal aid to education. People think of it as a giant admixture to the budget of a major urban district. It's not. It's usually something like 3% max. The other 97% is coming in very large part from the states. What's happened fundamentally in the history of the country is we started out with a concept of layer cake federalism in which each level of government was presumed to have a set of functions and a set of revenues to match, and you didn't meet them. You didn't match them. That lasted about 150 years, the principal exception being the Federal Land Grant College Act in the 19th century. And then particularly in the Depression, it fell apart because the federal government was in a position to do much more efficient financing. And that, from that point on, the federal government turned from being an operator. You know, there are only about 100,000 more employees, civilian employees in the federal government now than there were in 1960. That is, the federal government does not do direct operations. The federal government does banking, essentially. It's a bank and a criteria setter. And over time, the major industrial states had the same evolution, so that about 86 to 90% of the budget of a state is aid to localities who actually do it. The state's a banker. It's not an operator. Well, the war on poverty produced a series of things, most of which were rifle-shot admixtures to particular programs where the feds were particularly interested, and most of which came with essentially programmatically defined criteria. This is what some people have called picket fence federalism, that is to say, in which you pick out a particular area, like housing, for example, and you do a public housing program, you do a Section 8 program and all that, and the federal government's right there, whereas if you move right next door to some other program, the federal government isn't there at all. The war on poverty was enormously valuable in two ways. One, it did begin to persuade people that it was worth trying to address the problem of disadvantagedness in a systematic way, that in fact this was a problem which should be, as a whole, a centerpiece for federal activity. It never had been before. It had always been pieced into its various component parts. The other thing was it provided some very useful stimuli, let's put it that way, to thinking and innovation and programmatic operation in at the operating level, while at the same time applying some principles which were also useful, a lot of which had to do with anti-discrimination, redlining, for example, various things that really needed fighting got fought because the federal money was there, and they wouldn't have been if it hadn't been.
Let me thank our panelists. I think this is a great reflection. Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to that as well. Just a comment to make, I think for those of us in all walks of professional life, the idea of having to talk about linkages between inputs and outputs, between talking about assessment and evaluation criteria are part of what we live by. I recently completed an application to the Templeton Foundation for a grant for doing development at Baruch, and the proposal was basically having to do a performance project management plan, having to demonstrate that I had some idea of how I was going to measure whether anything I did was successful or failed or whatever. But we now take for granted that there is a accountability, responsibility that we all have if we undertake and get resources to invest in a program, that we have to be able to talk about what we've done and whether it had any benefit at all. And so that really comes out of the work that went on during that whole period. It's now just a natural part of life. So thank you, and I want to thank our panel again. This is the conclusion of this segment of the Lindsay Year Symposium, in which we've been looking at innovations that were introduced into the operation of New York City government from 1966 through 1973. This symposium is being held at Baruch College, and I look forward to seeing you when we return for the next installment of this symposium.